January 26, 1962. Lucky Luciano died of a heart attack at Naples International Airport in Italy. He was 64 years old. The man who'd built the modern American Mafia, who'd created the Commission, who'd organized crime itself into a business gone. News of his death spread through the underworld like electricity through water. Instant. Shocking. Irreversible. Within hours, arrangements were being made. Not just for a funeral, for a gathering. A moment when every power player in organized crime would come together to pay respects to the man who'd made them all possible. The funeral was scheduled for early February in New York, despite Luciano having died in exile. The Italian government allowed his body to be returned to America for burial, a gesture that showed just how much influence the Luciano family still wielded. And as word spread about the funeral, one question circulated through certain circles in Harlem. Would Bumpy Johnson attend? February 3rd, 1962. St. John Cemetery, Queens, New York. The funeral procession was something New York hadn't seen in decades. Black limousines stretched for blocks. Police helicopters circled overhead. FBI agents sat in unmarked cars, photographing everyone who entered. Inside the chapel, the gathering looked like a who's who of American organized crime. Vito Genovese, even though he was serving a prison sentence, had sent representatives. Carlo Gambino sat in the third row, his expression unreadable. Joe Bonanno was there. Joe Colombo. Tommy Lucchese. Meyer Lansky had flown in from Florida. Chicago sent representatives. Philadelphia. Boston. Detroit. Las Vegas. Every city where the Commission held influence had someone present. The room smelled of flowers, hundreds of arrangements, some costing thousands of dollars, all with cards bearing names that appeared in FBI files. The casket at the front was mahogany, expensive, covered in white roses. And seated throughout the chapel were men who controlled territories, ran empires, made decisions that affected millions of lives and billions of dollars. The hierarchy was visible in where people sat. The closest families in front, the associates and underbosses in the middle, the representatives from other cities toward the back. Everyone knew their place. Everyone understood the order of things. Security was tight. Men in dark suits stood at every entrance, checking faces against mental lists, ensuring no one unwanted entered this sacred space. The service began at 2 p.m. A priest spoke about Salvatore Lucania Luciano's birth name, about his journey from Sicily to America, about family and legacy, and eternal rest. But no one was really listening to the priest. They were watching each other, noting who sat where, who spoke to whom, who showed too much emotion or too little. This was business, even at a funeral, especially at a funeral. At 2:45 p.m., midway through the service, something happened that no one expected. The chapel doors opened, and Bumpy Johnson walked in. The first person to notice was one of the guards at the door, a soldier from the Genovese family named Anthony Russo. According to accounts, Russo's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket where he kept his peace. But he stopped, because Bumpy Johnson wasn't forcing his way in. He was just standing there, alone, wearing a perfectly tailored black suit, holding a leather suitcase in his right hand. Russo looked at his partner, uncertain. They hadn't been told to expect Bumpy Johnson, hadn't been given instructions about what to do if he showed up. The whisper started at the back of the chapel and spread forward like a wave. Bumpy's here. Johnson just walked in. What's he doing here? Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the priest faltered, noticing the sudden shift in attention. Bumpy stood at the entrance for a moment, surveying the room. His expression was calm, neutral, not defiant, not apologetic, just present. Carlo Gambino, sitting in the third row, turned completely around in his seat. Meyer Lansky's eyes narrowed. Joe Bonanno's face darkened. Because Bumpy Johnson, powerful as he was in Harlem, was not Italian. He was not part of the commission. He was not part of the family structure that this entire gathering represented. And yet here he stood, in a room filled with men who'd killed for lesser violations of protocol. No one spoke. No one moved. The tension in that chapel became almost physical, pressing down on everyone present. Bumpy took a step forward, then another. Walking slowly up the center aisle, the leather suitcase swinging slightly at his side. He passed the back rows where the out-of-town representatives sat. Past the middle rows where the underbosses and senior associates watched him with barely concealed hostility. Every step he took seemed impossibly loud in that silent room. He passed Carlo Gambino, past Meyer Lansky, past men who controlled more money and more soldiers than Bumpy could ever command. And no one stopped him. Later, when people asked why no one intervened, the answers varied. Some said it was respect for the funeral setting, that violence at Lucky Luciano's service would have been the ultimate disrespect. Others said it was curiosity. Everyone wanted to see what Bumpy Johnson was going to do. But a few, the ones who understood power at its deepest level, said it was something else entirely. It was recognition. Recognition that Bumpy Johnson, by walking into that room alone and unarmed, was making a statement. And you don't interrupt a man making a statement unless you're ready to make one of your own. Bumpy reached the front of the chapel. He stood there for a moment, looking at Lucky Luciano's casket. The two men had history. They'd negotiated the partnership that governed Harlem in the 1930s. They'd sat across tables and worked out terms that benefited both sides. They'd maintained a professional respect that transcended the racial divisions of the era. Bumpy set the suitcase down on the floor in front of the casket. The sound of the leather touching marble echoed through the chapel. Every eye in the room was locked on that suitcase. Meyer Lansky leaned forward slightly, his legendary mind already calculating what this meant, what Bumpy was doing. Carlo Gambino's jaw tightened. This was his family now, his territory to protect. And Bumpy Johnson was making a move on sacred ground. Bumpy knelt slowly, his knees touching the marble floor. He clasped his hands together in a gesture of prayer, and for 30 seconds he stayed there, head bowed, silent, paying respects. Not to the Mafia, not to the Commission, but to Lucky Luciano, the man. Then Bumpy stood, picked up the suitcase, and placed it on the small table beside the casket, the table that held flowers, candles, and a photograph of Luciano from his younger days. And then Bumpy Johnson opened the suitcase. Inside the suitcase was money. Stacks and stacks of cash. $100 bills, bundled and organized. The exact amount varies depending on who tells the story. Some say 500,000, others claim 1 million, a few insist it was even more. But the number didn't matter. What mattered was what the money represented. Bumpy didn't say a word. Didn't make a speech. Didn't explain himself. He just stood there, the open suitcase visible to everyone in the chapel, and let the message speak for itself. Meyer Lansky understood it immediately. His expression shifted from suspicion to something close to admiration. The money wasn't tribute. It wasn't payment. It wasn't asking for permission or protection. It was a declaration. The cash had been gathered from Harlem, from numbers bankers, nightclub owners, street bosses, every operator who worked in Bumpy Johnson's territory. It represented the economic power of an entire neighborhood, brought together and displayed in front of the most powerful mobsters in America. The message was clear. Harlem generates this kind of money. Harlem has this kind of organizational capacity. And Bumpy Johnson controls it all. Carlo Gambino's face was unreadable, but those who knew him well could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. This was a move. A power play. But executed so perfectly, so respectfully, that responding with violence would make the responder look small. Joe Bonanno shifted in his seat. He'd spent decades building his empire, and here was Bumpy Johnson, casually displaying wealth that rivaled what many families generated in months. One of the younger soldiers in the back whispered to his partner, "Is he crazy? Does he have a death wish?" The older soldier shook his head. "No. He's making us an offer we can't refuse." Because that's exactly what this was. Bumpy was saying, "Harlem is mine. Not yours. Not the commission's. Mine. And I have the resources, the organization, and the power to keep it that way. But I'm showing you respect by bringing this here. By honoring the man who first negotiated with me as an equal." Lucky Luciano, if he could have seen this moment, might have smiled. Because this was exactly the kind of move he would have appreciated: bold, strategic, respectful, and absolutely brilliant in its execution. Bumpy closed the suitcase, leaving the money on the table. He took one last look at Luciano's casket, nodded once, a gesture so subtle that most people missed it, and then turned around and walked back down the aisle. The same path he'd come, past the same men, through the same silence. But the silence was different now. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't uncertain. It was acknowledgement. By the time Bumpy reached the doors of the chapel, something fundamental had changed in that room. The hierarchy that everyone understood, the racial dynamics that governed organized crime, the assumption that Italian families would always control the profitable territories, all of it had been quietly, irreversibly challenged. And no one had fired a shot. No one had raised a voice. No one had made a threat. Bumpy Johnson walked out of Lucky Luciano's funeral the same way he'd walked in. Alone, calm, unarmed. But everything was different. After Bumpy left, the chapel remained silent for almost a full minute. Then Carlo Gambino spoke, his voice low but carrying through the room. "Close the suitcase. Put it with the other gifts for the family." It was a strategic response, neither accepting nor rejecting what Bumpy had done, just acknowledging it as a gesture of respect toward Luciano. But everyone in that room understood what had really happened. Meyer Lansky reportedly said later, to a close associate, "Bumpy Johnson just declared Harlem's independence, and he did it in a way that made it impossible for us to respond with anything but respect. That's the smartest move I've seen in 30 years. The funeral continued. The priest finished the service. People filed past the casket, offering their final respects. But the conversations afterward, in the cars and the restaurants and the social clubs, were all about one thing: Bumpy Johnson, the suitcase, the message. Within weeks, according to street accounts, there was a shift in how the Italian families approached Harlem. Proposals that would have been demands became negotiations. Territorial discussions that would have been one-sided became actual conversations. The FBI, monitoring everything, noted the change in their surveillance reports. One agent wrote, "Subject Johnson appears to have elevated his status among Italian organized crime figures following appearance at Luciano funeral. Previous tensions regarding Harlem territory appear to have stabilized." The money itself, whatever amount it actually was, disappeared into the Luciano family's hands. Some say it went to his relatives in Italy. Others claim it was distributed among the families as a gesture of goodwill. A few insist it was donated to Catholic charities in Luciano's name. But the money was never the point. The point was the moment, the statement, the shift. Bumpy Johnson had walked into a room full of men who could have killed him and made them all recognize something they'd been reluctant to admit. Harlem was not a territory to be controlled. It was a power to be respected. Now, as with many legendary moments, the exact details are disputed. Some accounts place the amount at $500,000. Others say $1 million. A few claim there was no suitcase at all, that Bumpy simply attended the funeral and his presence alone was the statement. What's documented is this: Bumpy Johnson did have a relationship with Lucky Luciano that dated back to the 1930s. Luciano did die in 1962. And the power dynamics between Italian organized crime families and Harlem's operators did shift during this period. Whether the suitcase moment happened exactly as legend describes, or whether it's a story that captured a broader truth about that shift, what matters is what the story represents. It represents the moment when Harlem stopped being seen as territory and started being seen as partnership. It represents a black crime boss commanding respect in a room dominated by white mobsters, something virtually unprecedented in that era. It represents the power of symbolic gestures, of understanding when a single move can say more than 1,000 words. And it represents Bumpy Johnson's genius for knowing when to fight and when to make a statement so powerful that fighting becomes unnecessary. Real power isn't always about confrontation. Sometimes, it's about presence, about showing up where you're not expected and conducting yourself with such confidence that people have to acknowledge you. Sometimes, it's about symbols, about understanding that the right gesture at the right moment can shift perceptions more effectively than any threat. And sometimes, it's about respect, about honoring those who came before, especially when it serves your strategic interests. Bumpy Johnson understood all of this. He could have stayed away from Lucky Luciano's funeral, could have avoided the risk, could have let the Italian families bury their dead without interference. But by showing up, by bringing that suitcase, by making that gesture, he did something that violence never could have accomplished. He made them see Harlem and him as equals. Not supplicants, not subordinates, not territories to be managed. Equals. And once you establish that, once you make the most powerful people in the room acknowledge your standing, everything that follows becomes negotiation instead of domination. That's the genius of what Bumpy Johnson allegedly did that day. He didn't demand respect. He demonstrated it, both for Luciano and for himself. And in doing so, he elevated not just his own status, but the status of everyone he represented. The funeral of Lucky Luciano was a gathering of power, but when Bumpy Johnson walked in with that suitcase, it became something else. It became the moment Harlem stood equal to the commission, without a shot fired, without a voice raised, without anything but presence, preparation, and perfect execution. That's power. If this story showed you what real power looks like, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to Bumpy Johnson, the Harlem Godfather, for stories that reveal the brilliance behind the legend. Turn on notifications so you never miss one. Drop a comment. What would you have done in Bumpy's position? What does this gesture teach you about respect and power? Remember, in Harlem, respect wasn't given. It was earned. And Bumpy Johnson earned every ounce of his, even in a room full of men who ruled the underworld. This is Bumpy Johnson, the Harlem Godfather. And we're just getting started.